The surprises keep on coming in the NFL, but injuries and suspensions mean opportunities for savvy fantasy managers. So we take you through all the best waiver wire pickups on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley, and welcome to the Fantasy First Down as we hit the waiver wire for week 9. Now, if you got any waiver wire questions, of course, look through the show and take tips from our rankings. But you can also hit us up on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or DM us on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O if you got any questions, or just leave them in the comments below. Would be good if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. Plus, you can also check out my rankings coming up soon on ffdfantasyfootball.com. Plus, I've got an article with streamers and stashes in it coming out on football.rasball.com. But let's get into the waiver wire ads for this week. And we're talking quarterbacks first, and plenty of quarterbacks popping off this week. Sam Darnold has been surprisingly solid this season, and he gets a pretty good run of games. The one this week is against the Colts, and we've seen anyone score against the Colts. There is no reason the Vikings shouldn't be able to do so. They'll definitely be wanting to bounce back after their surprise loss last week. So I am expecting that this will be a good matchup for Sam Darnold. Matthew Stafford, of course, was the player that beat the Vikings last week, and he gets the Seahawks. Not as good a matchup, but we've seen that he can be a lot better with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua back. Plenty of upside there. I'm happy to pick him up and just see what happens with him. Although he's not the greatest matchup this week, he does have some good ones going forward. Kirk Cousins has been very good against the Buccaneers. We've yet to see how good he can be against other teams. He gets Dallas, which should be a good matchup. He's a top 12 quarterback this season, which seems kind of crazy. But we have to see him do it against teams that aren't Tampa because he doesn't face them again this season. So I would pick him up and stash him if you're interested. I don't really want to start him this week against Dallas, even though it's not the worst matchup, but I do think he has upside. Another player with upside is Jameis Winston, but he faces the Chargers this week, and I feel like this could be a bounce back and not in the correct direction for Jameis. He looked very good last week against the Ravens, but that was always going to be a fantastic matchup. This is a far tougher matchup against the Chargers. They are one of the best teams against quarterbacks, so I don't particularly love Winston this week. I do like the idea, though, of getting him on my bench for those buys weeks, or if you need a quarterback in a Superflex league or in a 1QB league where you're really struggling at the position. Running backs, and I mean, there's no one really jumping out at the moment, but Rico Dowdle remains my favorite. He is the number one in Dallas, but he was out last minute with an illness this week. Of course, he was on a bye the week before. This is the only reason he's even available in leagues. He is the clear starter. We've seen how much Zeke and Dalvin Cook have struggled. He should be getting a heavy workload that will increase during the season, and he has some good matchups later on. I also really like Tyrone Tracy. Arguably, you could have him ahead of Dowdle. Problem with Tracy is he's got a concussion. It's unclear whether he'll play this week. Usually, players coming off a concussion miss a week, especially on Monday Night Football. But it is technically possible he plays this week. Regardless, do really like his upside. He's unlikely to get the full load because of Devin Singletary, but it does seem to have taken the starting job, and that is a real positive thing. There aren't many clear starters available, especially not in half of leagues. Alexander Mattison, another starter at the moment. Zamir White came back and got 2 snaps. 2 total snaps for Zamir White. This was a guy that a lot of us loved coming into the season. I was confident that Madison would be involved, but more of a passing down back. A little bit surprised that he's come in and taken the lead role. He was pretty terrible. He was getting barely over a yard a carry, but it was a very tough matchup, and they might give him another go against the Bengals. Also possible they'll do something totally different, especially if they're out of playoff contention. They do seem like they're hitting a bit of a rebuild. And Bucky Irving, hard to trust Bucky. At least Sean Tucker appears to be out of the rotation. He was only out there for 7 snaps. He got 2 carries and a reception. But I do think they're going to continue to phase him out and focus on White as more of a receiving back, and Irving is more of an early down back. And there's a good chance he'll get the goal line carries, which could be very valuable, especially in this offense that does seem to have been going very well with Baker, even with Mike Evans out and Chris Godwin is, of course, out for the season. So that does give Irving some upside. I do fear that we'll see more White in games where we don't have the wide receivers because they do need their receiving back more. But we saw in the game this week, or at least last weekend, that they at least used Irving enough to make him valuable. Now, the slightly deeper starting options, I'm not necessarily saying I like these guys better than the stashes to come. It's more just that you can at least start them on a weekly basis and get some value out of them. The odds say they're 2.5 point favorites in what should be a high scoring game. Whether that means they ride Algier like they often do when they're winning is a big question mark, but I do feel like he at least has some weekly upside for the most part, especially when you know they're favorites. Plus, he's probably the most valuable handcuff outside Braylon Allen. I do feel like if Bijan goes down, all of a sudden you've got a top 10 guy. Jalen Warren on a weekly basis, solid. We saw how solid he was this week as well. He's going to put up like low end running back 3 numbers, high end running back 4 numbers. Does have a little bit of touchdown upside, although didn't get those opportunities this week. So I do feel like Warren is someone that you can rely on for that reason. If he's available in your league, he's worth picking up. He's got a bye this week, but I'd get in now, stash him on my bench if you're really struggling at the running back position. Kid Mitchell, another guy that's available if you're struggling. I do feel like they're going to use him as a change of pace guy. I don't think Derrick Henry is going to keep getting the same amount of carries all season. And with Mitchell healthy, I do think that we're going to see him get 6, 7, 8 carries a week. With the way he plays, that can be very valuable. He's been on IR, but he has to come off soon or he's going to be out for the season. So it's worth stashing him on your bench and just seeing what happens. And Roschon Johnson, this is a bit of a weird one. He's mostly a stash, but of all the starting options available in less than 50% of leagues, which is my cutoff for the deep starting waiver options, I think Roschon's probably a guy that I'd at least be happy to use in a given week because they keep using him on the goal line. DeAndre Swift is getting the vast majority of the carries, but on the goal line, they're bringing Johnson. We saw that happen 3 or 4 times in this game. Swift does get the occasional goal line carry, but Johnson's getting a lot of them, and that means he does have some upside, even though he doesn't get a lot of touches. So if you're really desperate for a guy to start, I'd probably prefer him than a lot of the guys in the stash area. Speaking of stashes, all the same guys. Braylon Allen, my favorite stash. Ray Davis, very high on as well. Blake Corum, arguably a slightly better stash if you don't need to start him at all than Ray Davis. But I do feel like Davis has a huge amount of upside. But Corum is a guy where if he gets that starting role, he could be a top 10 player. And Ty Chandler got like 2 touches last week, 2 snaps last week. But if Aaron Jones goes down, I think he's probably the clear starter. It's not like Cam Akers is threatening his job. It's just they're really riding Jones at the moment. I do think there are going to be games where they're clearly ahead. Potentially this week where you see a bit more Ty Chandler, but he is very much a backup who will have plenty of upside if Jones goes down because he is going to get an every down role. Wide receivers, and there's a surprising amount of good wide receivers available, partly because of all the injuries that have happened and partly because of the way the backfields have changed over the course of the season, not backfields, receiving rooms over the course of the season. Daniel Moody is still available in an alarming amount of leagues. This is a guy who's the wide receiver 12 on the season, and he's available in a quarter of leagues. If you're one of those leagues, please pick him up. I don't know what you're doing, but just pick him up. Romeo Dobbs have been talking about for a few weeks now. He hasn't yet performed like the number one in Green Bay, but he is technically the number one based on snap count. You are still going to see a lot of Watson and Wicks as they split that role. And Jalen Reed is, of course, very valuable, even though he's only out there in 11 personnel. So Dobbs is going to get the most snaps, and he is going to be valuable with those snaps, but you're still going to see plenty of the other guys. Just remember, if Malik Willis is starting, and we don't know what's happening this week, at least at the time I'm recording this video, but that is going to have a big impact on all those pass catchers. So if you're getting Willis starting, I don't know that I trust anyone except maybe Reed. Khalil Shakir has been very good. It's a little bit of a question mark with what's happening out wide. Keon Coleman seemed to be getting starting snaps, but you can't trust him to be getting the looks if we see more Amari Cooper. Cooper's kind of splitting with Mac Hollins, and that's ugly, but none of this is affecting Shakir. The only issue for Shakir is if Curtis Samuel comes back and then starts taking more snaps. But Shakir's looks so good when given the opportunity. I think that he's probably the guy you want to own here, even though I don't particularly want to own any of the guys in this wide receiver room. Cortland Sutton has some upside. We saw him have a good week last week. That wasn't entirely a shock for me. He was mentioned in my Streamers and Stashes show. He's got a fantastic matchup against Baltimore this week. If you're going to start any of these guys this week, I think Sutton arguably has the most upside. Mooney has a lot of upside too, and Dobbs has a good matchup, but I do really like Sutton this week. I feel like he could go 100 yards again and potentially score a touchdown, or he could put up no points and just be really annoying as he's been at times this season. Deeper waiver options, and Christian Watson I talked about. Look, he's been splitting with Wicks in a really weird way. They keep bouncing back and forth with usage. It's very confusing. It looked like Wicks was going to be the main guy, especially in receiving downs last week. And then all of a sudden this week, Watson was pretty much an every down starter. He was very close to it. He suddenly had this highest snap percentage and highest route percentage since the start of the season, essentially. First time he's been a clear starter since week 1 and 2. So it's a very strange situation. I don't trust it to hold because we've seen it bounce back and forth so much. But if he can keep this up, it is a highly valuable role. He's got a lot of touchdown upside and he's going to make big plays at times. And that means he's worth stashing, but I wouldn't start him yet, even though it's a good matchup, because you just don't trust that they're not going to bounce back and use a heap of Wicks instead. Juju Smith-Schuster is obviously injured, but once he's healthy, he's still going to be the starting slot receiver. Even with DeAndre Hopkins coming back, they were just kind of switching him around with Watson and Worthy. I do think that Smith-Schuster is still going to be the starting slot guy. You're going to see a little bit of Mecole Hardman, who's in the slot at the moment, but Smith-Schuster is the main guy. We saw how good he was when given the opportunity. He's still someone I want on my bench for when he's healthy. Jerry Jeudy should have been the number one guy in Denver, but it didn't really turn out that way. It's been a lot of Cedric Tillman, but it wouldn't surprise me if Jeudy returns to being the number one guy, and it's just being kind of like fluke usage with Tillman. So look out for that situation. I do think it's possible that Jeudy becomes the main guy and the guy you want to own. And Jalen McMillan, he is the clear number one at the moment for the Bucs. And this week against KC, you just can't start him because he's facing KC. And then Mike Evans will come back in a couple of weeks and suddenly he's going to be the number two guy and he's going to lose a whole heap of value. But he is still a guy that I kind of want on my roster. I feel like there's some upside there. Certainly in week 10, he's someone you can probably start. I don't know. He's not someone I'm going out of my way to get, but I do think he's a solid deep option. And an even deeper option that I like more than some of these other guys is Cedric Tillman. I would consider taking Tillman over, I know a lot of those guys, over Jeudy, potentially, over Smith-Schuster maybe. Maybe not over Smith-Schuster. Depends on your situation if you need to start him now. Potentially even over Watson if you don't want to take risk, because I do think Tillman has a whole heap of upside. For reasons I don't understand, I can't find an up-to-date photo, like a headshot photo of Cedric Tillman. If you can find me one, let me know, because I went to all my normal places and I couldn't find one. Same thing with Michael Wilson, weirdly. But Cedric Tillman, fantastic the last 2 weeks. He was a streamer for me last week. He was one of the guys I mentioned in my streamers article. I only had 3 playing last week. And he was one of them. And of course, was the wide receiver 3 on the week, had another big week. He gets the Chargers this week. Don't like starting him this week, but I would definitely pick him up. In fact, I started him in 4 leagues last week because I was confident he'd go well. I'm starting him in none of those leagues, except maybe potentially the 32-teamer. We'll see. But yeah, look, not a good starter this week, but someone you should definitely pick up. Michael Wilson had another big game. He does have these pop-up big games, or at least big-ish games. He's the wide receiver 30 in a pretty high-scoring week. Has some upside, especially if something happens to Marvin Harrison, or if they get the right matchup, or if they just start to pass the ball a little bit more. All of those things are possible. I do think Chicago is not the right matchup, but he's someone it is worthwhile getting on your bench as a bye-week filler. Xavier Legette, it's hard to really trust him because we know Deontay Johnson will probably be back, assuming he's not traded away, and Adam Thielen will probably be back, assuming he's not traded away or just shut down for the season. So keep your ear to the ground for those. If both of those guys come back and don't get traded, all of a sudden Legette suddenly has no value again. But at the moment, he is someone that I'm interested in having on my roster. And Elijah Moore finally getting some touches. He's been getting the snaps. He's had the role, but he hasn't been getting the touches until Jameis Winston turns up. All of a sudden, they're passing the ball a heaps. Suddenly, Elijah Moore becomes a valid option. Do you want to pick him up? Maybe. That's really up to you. I personally wouldn't, but in a really deep league where most of these guys aren't available, all of a sudden he becomes a viable option. And tight ends. National Tight End Day was fantastic. Cade Otton was one of my streamers for the week. He's someone I suggested picking up last week. Hopefully he did. After his boom game last week, he's the tight end 6 on the season, which is kind of crazy. He is definitely someone that you can start this week against KC, who has conceded the second most points against tight ends. And I expect they're going to use him a lot with no Mike Evans and no Chris Godwin. They also will likely be chasing the game at times. Zach Ertz had another good week this week. Solid week at least. Keeps getting targets, keeps getting yardage. That makes him more reliable than most tight ends, even if he's not getting the touchdowns of some. I do like the idea of picking him up and using him in bye weeks if necessary, or if I'm really struggling at the position. Now, it seems like Stephon Diggs could be out for the season, but at the time I'm recording this, we don't have clear evidence of exactly what's going to happen. If that happens and Nico Collins is still out, they have to start using Dalton Schultz. They can't be relying on guys like Robert Woods and Xavier Hutchinson. That's just not a reliable option. I know they're going to have Tank Dell at times, but Dalton Schultz needs to be getting more targets. It can't be all Joe Mixon, all Tank Dell, and nobody else. So that's why I'd suggest, or at least consider picking him up if you're in a deeper league and you're a little bit desperate. Having said that, his ownership percentage is 63%, which is kind of insane to me. But I do think there are going to be leagues where people are more aggressive in dropping him because of disappointing performances. And in those cases, he's someone you can pick up. And Taysom Hill, I mean, you know what you're going to get out of Taysom Hill. Really fluky usage. He's going to have those weeks. Ironically, when he was facing me in my home league, it's always the way where he gets 2 touchdowns. And there are other weeks where he'll do absolutely nothing like last week. As he gets healthier, I think he'll get used more, especially if Kendre Miller is out, which it looks like he might be. They could mean we see more Taysom Hill rather than bringing Jordan Mims back into the squad. So Taysom Hill, a viable option, but I don't like him as much as some experts do. And finally, kickers and DST streamers. Cyber, number 2 on the season, but still available in over half of leagues. What are you doing? I do know that Jaden Daniels was out last week, and so that scared a lot of people off. As it turned out, he played, and if we'd known that, we all would have ranked Cyber higher. But I do still think that Cyber is going to be a fantastic option for the rest of the season and this week in particular. Cameron Dicker, anyone whose name rhymes with kicker, I'm a fan of. In this case, he gets a good matchup against the Browns and what could be one of those weird grind fests where the Browns turn the ball over a heap, but then defend well, and ultimately we see a whole heap of field goals for Chargers. I just like the idea of starting him. He's been good the last couple of weeks. This feels like the kind of game where he'll be good again. And finally, DST, Saints against Carolina. I say it every week. Start your running backs, kickers, and DSTs against the Panthers. Just not the kicker this week because I do think the Saints might struggle to score as well. But yeah, against Carolina, start the DST, especially Saints DST that's been solid this season. And the Chargers have been surprisingly solid too. They get the Browns. James Winston can be very turnover prone. I know he's very good against the Ravens, but I'm not sure that he's necessarily going to bounce back and do it again. So we shall see what happens. And that's all we've got for the Waiver Wire show for week 9. I hope your season's going well. If you've got any questions, as always, make sure you ask down in the comments below or on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. Our website's ffdfantasyfootball.com. I always have the rankings up there by Thursday, before Thursday Night Football, usually Thursday morning or even Wednesday night. Plus, of course, it'd be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube so you don't miss any of our great content. And I'll have a couple of articles coming out at football.rasball.com as well. I look forward to seeing you guys for the Streamers and Stashes show in a couple of days' time. I will see you then.